Hey, what is up, guys? Today I want to talk about the Glycine Airman. So, this watch was definitely a pleasant surprise for me. I really tend to gravitate towards dive watches because they can withstand the rigors of daily use. I have kids and I'm always around water. I'm always working on something as well, like my dirt bikes and four wheelers and cars and stuff. So, if you haven't watched any of those videos and any of that kind of stuff appeals to you, I have a few on my YouTube channel as well. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, check it out. I just rebuilt my son's little XR70 and that's a 4-stroke. So if you're kind of into that stuff with, cams and the lobes and timing and stuff like that, definitely check it out if you're interested. I know if you like mechanical watches, you're probably um, into that sort of thing as well. However, back to the Glycine Airman, I really think this watch checks a lot of boxes for me personally. It's tough, and it has a water resistance rating equal to a lot of dive watches. Um, so it you don't have to really worry about it, getting wet or anything. It also, invokes a sense of adventure, being a pilot's watch, and it's even nostalgic when you really start thinking about it and looking into the history and everything. So I gotta say I'm a big fan of this watch. So let's flip the camera around and get into the review. So I wouldn't normally talk about the history of a watch, but I really do feel like the Airman warrants it, and I feel like it adds to the overall enjoyment that I personally get out of this watch. So let's get into a little bit of the history for both Glycine and the Airman respectively. So the story goes there was a representative of Glycine on a flight, and he was talking to one of the pilots, and he asked him what he would want out of a pilot's watch, and they came up with a dual time 24-hour dial watch with a locking bezel that would meet the needs of current pilots at that time. After that, the rest is history, as they say. The Airman became really popular amongst both pilots and soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War, and it even made it to space in 1965 on the Gemini 5 space mission, and again in 1966 on the Gemini 11 mission, both times worn by astronaut Charles Conrad, whose name just sounds like it belongs on a space mission. So, this was, of course, his personal watch, and he was also wearing his Omega Speedmaster as well. But I just find it really interesting to know that he chose to take his Airman with him, and it made it back from both missions successfully, and I think that's just a testament to this watch's durability. So, as for Glycine itself, it was founded as a company in 1914 and has a long history, so I won't go over everything in this video, but I will highlight some of their more notable achievements. So, they started out as a movement manufacturer, specializing in small calibers for women's watches. They were also one of the first to make automatic movements, and as early as 1930, they were filing patents on an automatic module. And this wasn't an automatic movement in the traditional sense, but a module that could be attached to many already existing manual wind movements, giving it the convenience of an automatic. And you can see just how practical this would have been, especially at the time. Glycine was also one of the many watch companies to use compressor cases made by the case manufacturer EPSA, and I will talk about that a little more later on in the video. Glycine also made the vacuum case, which are cased up in an airless atmosphere. These had advantages like never having to be relubricated, running more accurately due to having less friction, and being very water resistant. But I think maybe one of the more overlooked aspects of Glycine is perhaps its location. So it's located in Bienne, Switzerland, which lays on the language boundary of both German and French-speaking Switzerland. And you can see both in the Airman, so you get that no-nonsense kind of tool watch vibe from the German side, but you also get some nice polished beveled edges here on the lugs, giving it a little bit of French flair. So let's get into some of the specs. We have a case diameter of 46 millimeters. I measured that from 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock. We have a case thickness of 12.5 millimeters. I measured that from the very center of the case back to the top of the double dome sapphire crystal. And 12.5 is really quite thin. As you can see from the side shot there, it really sits just a little bit higher than my wrist hair. You'll have no trouble sliding this underneath the cuff. We do have a longer lug-to-lug distance of 56 millimeters. And I know that's going to turn a lot of people away right there, but hear me out. I really do believe that if you have a 7-inch wrist or bigger, you can wear this 46 millimeter watch no problem. And I'll try to explain that a little bit better. So if we compare that to another large watch, here's my Baby Tuna. It has a case diameter of 47 millimeters, but as many of you are probably aware, Seiko often utilize a shorter lug-to-lug distance, enabling even a larger watch to wear quite well on the wrist. But we can't treat the 56 millimeters on the Glycine Airman the same as we do this lug-to-lug distance, and I'll try to illustrate the difference between the two. So if we take a pen or anything else straight, and we go across the bottom of the lugs, you can see that the pen actually touches the case back. So the lug tips and the case back are all on the same plane. So we have to treat this like a linear measurement. But if we do that on the Glycine Airman, and we go across the lug tips, you can see just how high up the center of the case back is from the lowest point of the lugs. So we're going to treat this like a circular measurement. And keeping that in mind, we can use that 56 millimeters and plug it into our equation to find circumference. That way we know the smallest possible wrist size that this watch could still possibly fit comfortably. So we're going to take that 56 and divide it by 2. That gives us our radius. And we're going to plug that into our equation, C equals 2 times pi times r. And that gives us a circumference of 175.84 millimeters. We're just going to round that up to 176 millimeters. And to convert that from millimeters back into inches, we're going to divide that by 25.4, giving us a circumference of 6.9. And we're just going to round that up to 7 inches even. And Glycine is well aware of this, because even if you take the strap and you put it on the smallest hole and you measure the inner circumference, you actually get 7 inches on the dot. So Glycine did want this watch to be worn on a broad variety of wrist sizes. But if your wrist is smaller than 7 inches, or if you just have a different wrist preference, the Glycine Airman is available in case sizes from 39 all the way up to 46. So let's get into some of the design features and case characteristics. So I really am just a fan of the Airman lugs. That's just kind of grown on me over time. I really appreciate this sharp break from the mid case to the lugs themselves. I really think it helps to break up the case band. It just adds a lot of character to the overall case design. I also appreciate how the bezel slightly sinks down into the lug hoods, just allowing the watch to be that much thinner. Plus, I also think it just looks cool. I also appreciate how they kept the case profile round, even in between the lugs. I know that seems like a small detail at first, but they really took a lot of time and effort to allow this to happen. So they could have easily squared these off, or they could have used curved spring bars to maintain that round case profile. In fact, there's actually a secondary hole inside the Airman lugs to utilize curved spring bars if you so chose to do so. But if you took a look from the case back side, you can see about 3/4 of the way down that they actually milled out a little notch there, allowing the upper portion to maintain that round case profile. But that little notch also allows the watch strap to sit as close as possible to the case while still maintaining its full range of motion. Taking a look at the case back, you'll note that it's actually very broad, coming right to the edge of the case itself. It's also very flat, and this just provides a lot of surface area for the watch to sit nice and planted on the wrist. So we do have a display case back, and around that we have some information radially displayed, like the model number, sapphire crystal, and the water resistance rating. So this watch does have 100 meters of water resistance, and that's thanks in part to this case back being a screw down case back, and that works in tandem with the screw down crown. So inside this crown tube, there's a gasket inside the tube itself. There's also a secondary gasket inside the crown, and that secondary gasket will seal up against the face of the crown tube when it's screwed down, locking in that 100 meters of water resistance. I did find it a little odd that the first gasket was inside the tube instead of on the crown itself, like most crowns are. But I do think that the gasket being inside the crown tube gives the crown stem less room to wiggle around. It does make the crown feel a little more stout when you're using it. One of my favorite design features of this watch is the cross hatching found on the crown. So I used to think that that was a reference to longitude and latitude, and that in of itself was a reference to this being a pilot's watch. But it turns out that this was introduced way back in the 1960s alongside the compressor cases. And I talked about that a little bit earlier on in the history section of this video. So I really appreciate that design detail. Just makes the Glycine Airman feel like an absolute time capsule. And you will see this cross-hatching found on some other brands like the Longines Legend Diver and also the JLC Polaris. So let's talk about the crown size. So this is an 8.4 millimeter pilot style crown. So it's an oversized crown, and you get some advantages with that. It's just easy and practical to use. But I also appreciate that they kept the crown quite thin, and it's also very flat. So when it's on the wrist, this crown doesn't dig into your wrist at all, like some other oversized larger crowns can. So I appreciate that little detail because you get all the usability and practicality of a larger crown, but all the comfortability of a smaller crown. So let's talk about what is the most iconic case feature of this watch, and that is of course the 4 o'clock locking crown. So it too is of an adequate size, features the same knurling so it's easy to grip and use. It is signed with the Glycine logo. So unscrewing it, you can see it backs out this little clamp that engages with the coin edging of the bezel. And that allows you to spin the bidirectional friction fit bezel. And I have to be honest, guys, I didn't really get the friction fit bezel at first. I was used to having dive bezels and having clicks. And Glycine does do a really well done 48 click bidirectional bezel. I have one here on my Glycine Airman Sphere, and I'll go ahead and let you guys take a listen to that. I also have one on my Glycine Combat Sub GMT. So Glycine sweating the details, and they also do just, a bidirectional bezel really well. But I have to say, quite surprisingly, that I actually prefer the friction fit bezel. So it's just easy to use, right? So it's no fuss, plus you can just get to where you need to very quick and easily. Plus, I have to say that it goes hand in hand with the locking crown. So this locking crown would have been revolutionary back in the 1960s. So even dive bezels back then were friction fit and didn't have clicks. So this locking crown is going to be more secure than clicks could ever be. And that's really useful when you have a GMT bezel because you could be tracking a secondary time zone for weeks or even months. So I have to say it came as a pleasant surprise to me that I actually enjoy the friction fit bezel more than I do having clicks now. And I really just think that it's nostalgic, and it's also how the original Glycine Airman would have been. Like I said, this watch feels like an absolute time capsule, and I appreciate little details like that the longer I own this watch. So it does come on a really comfortable leather strap, and these are comfortable right out of the gate. So they're nice and thin, they don't have a lot of volume or padding, and that makes them nice and pliable um, right out of the box. And like I said, really comfortable to wear. So it is a black leather strap with some contrasting white stitching. On the underside, it has matching brown stitching. And it does taper from 24 millimeters at the lugs down to 21 millimeters at the buckle. And the buckle is fully brushed, which I think is a nice detail because let's face it, the buckle is going to get all scratched up anyway. So it being fully brushed is going to hide a lot of those. And the buckle does have almost an organic form to it, kind of like a teardrop shape. And it's got a really deep arch in here. So you can see when the strap is inside of the buckle, it really sits inside of it instead of stacking up on it. And that really allows it to wear nice and thin and be comfortable when it's on the wrist as well. It does have two keepers. One is stationary and it's signed Glycine. The other is a floating keeper. One of my favorite things about this keeper, I don't know how well you can see that, is the keeper is actually tapered to match the strap. So it's tapered on the big end. So even if you're on the lowest hole of the strap and your keeper's way up here, it's going to engage with both sides, the small side and the tapered side that will ride up this back half. But even if you're on the first hole, it's still going to be beneficial to you and hold your strap in place. I think that's also a thoughtful little design detail as well. And actually, this is the only watch I've ever seen that has a tapered keeper like that. So let's take a better look at the case finishing. There's a deep grain brushing on the lug hoods with that crisp, polished beveled edge. We have a really clean concentric brushing on the 24-hour bezel. That plays nicely in the light. We have a double dome sapphire crystal with 3 layers of blue anti-reflective coating on the underside. Under the crystal, we have a nice matte charcoal dial that is non-reflective and highly legible. We have some silver metallic printing around all the indices. We also have a fully polished handset that is beveled in the center, and that adds some dimension to the handset. I really enjoy this handset. They have a unique shape to them. It's a stretched hexagon shape, and you can see this echoed throughout the design. It is on the hour hand, the minute hand, the tip of the seconds hand, as well as the counterbalance. It is also on the GMT hand, where it is partially skeletonized, and it is really satisfying when it lines up with its counterparts at the 12, 3, 6, and 9. I really enjoy how they tied this design element in so well. It gives the overall design a lot of continuity. I also appreciate that they skeletonized the GMT hand because it doesn't obscure the dial, but it is there when you need it. I also appreciate that the GMT hand is loomed, but perhaps my favorite thing about this handset is how precise it is. They are almost surgical in precision. That is kind of fitting because they are syringe style hands, but it really just satisfies my OCD, and I appreciate when a watch doesn't suffer from short hand syndrome. I find myself just staring at the seconds hand as it glides along, just brushing up against every one of those markers on the outer track. And I also appreciate that the minute hand does the same. It just makes it easier to read at a glance. I also like to point out that the date window is enlarged, and that is unique to the 46mm case version. I just appreciate that they enlarge the date window when they enlarge the case size. I think that's a thoughtful detail, and it doesn't only just make the dial feel more well balanced, but it also makes the date more legible. So taking a closer look at the movement here, so we do have a display case back so we can see the movement. And one of the things I'd like to point out right away is that Glycine used a metal spacer here. So I have taken the case back off of even my combat subs that have solid case backs, and I'd like to point out that those use a metal spacer as well. So I think that says a lot about the brand and the integrity that they have. I'm looking at some of the other big brands like Tag Heuer, who use plastic spacer rings, and I just think that this says a lot about Glycine, especially at the price point. So you can see right there, right above the balance, the SW330-1 and the Salida sign there. We do have a decorated custom rotor with some Coats de Genève on it, a little prop plane, which I think is really cool, and it is signed in the Glycine Airman. So this movement does beat at 4 hertz or 28,800 beats per hour. It has 25 joules and a power reserve of 42 hours. It does hack and hand wind as well. So this is what I found on Glycine's website. In this particular model and all of their other GMT Airman is the elaborate grade of the SW330-1. And this is what I found out on Caliber Corner. So this movement does come in 3 grades: elaborate, premium, and chronometer. So it doesn't even have a base grade like an ATA 2824 would or an SW 200. So right out of the gate, you're getting some more furnishings with this movement. So even in this elaborate grade, it is adjusted in 4 positions with an average rate of plus minus 5 seconds per day. And I can personally speak from experience. I have 4 watches with this movement inside of it, and all of them run within that window. Actually, all of them run either plus 2 or plus 4 seconds a day. So really think these are well-performing movements. I do have a top grade version of this movement, and it's the ETA version. So comparing that to the elaborate grade Salida, if these watches had closed case backs, I couldn't distinguish which movement was inside one without looking at it. So in terms of performance, they perform on the same level in my opinion. So really the only difference is finishing. Apart from that though, the top grade does have one advantage that I wish these had, and that is the Glucidor balance. And Glucidor is an alloy of beryllium, copper, and iron, and it is more temperature resistant and it is more shock resistant. So, but like I said, apart from that, in terms of performance, I couldn't distinguish the difference between this and the top grade. So they all perform really quite well. So let's get into some of the functions. So unscrewing the crown, here in the first position, you can hand wind the movement. If you didn't know, the SW330 has some of the smoothest winding I've ever really felt. In the second position, you can use the quick set date. And turning in the other direction, you can jump the GMT hand by hour increments. And then pulling out the crown all the way hacks the seconds hand so you can set the time. So let's go ahead and utilize our GMT hand. But before I do that, real quick, I do often use my GMT hand as a day-night indicator. So I have it synced up to my local time zone. And that's useful because when I go through my rotation and I get back to this watch, I like to reference the GMT hand before I use the quick set date. So I know that if my GMT hand isn't in between the 9 and the 2, that I'm pretty much out of the danger zone and I can go ahead and cycle through my quick set. And that's pretty convenient. So that's why I have it set to my local time zone majority of the time, unless I'm traveling or something like that. So it's useful for that as well. But let's go ahead and use it for a traveling scenario. So there are 2 methods to do this. So in this scenario, we're going to go ahead and travel from Los Angeles, California to New York. And New York is 3 hours ahead of you. So we'll go ahead and we hopped on a plane and now we're in New York. So it is 4 o'clock p.m. We left when it was 1 o'clock p.m. And now we need to reference our home time zone that's back in Los Angeles. So we know it's 1 o'clock there because it's 3 hours behind us. So we're going to go ahead and jump our GMT hand by hour increments and go ahead and cycle through until we get back to 1300 hours or 1 o'clock p.m. So now we know that it's 4 o'clock in our local time zone and it's 1 o'clock p.m. in our home time zone. So we're referencing both here. The second method is a lot easier and it's the way most people are going to use this. So let's go ahead and sync our GMT hand back up to our local time, 4 o'clock p.m. So in this scenario, or with this method rather, we're just going to utilize our GMT bezel. So again, you hopped on a plane from Los Angeles and you flew to New York and you set your time, your local time to 4 o'clock p.m. And now you want to reference your home time. So you just unscrew your bezel and you go ahead and set it to 1300 or 1 o'clock p.m. And now you've accomplished the same thing with a lot less work. So this is more convenient. You do have to ignore this inner 24-hour scale, but as long as you only reference this outer scale, this method will work just fine for you for traveling. So let's track all 3 time zones now. So let's say you really liked it in New York, you traveled there, so now you live there and you're a business person in New York and you have multiple clients around the world. So let's say you have clients in London, and London is 5 hours ahead of you. So it's 4 o'clock where you are, it's going to be 9 p.m. in London or 2100 hours on the GMT scale. And we're going to go ahead and bump our GMT hand to 2100 hours. So now we know that it is 4 o'clock where we are and it's 9 o'clock in London. And let's say we also have business partners in Tokyo, Japan. So they are 14 hours ahead of you. So it's a whole nother day in Japan. So it's going to be 6 o'clock a.m. in Japan. So now we just go ahead and utilize our third time zone on our bezel here. So now we know it's 6 o'clock a.m. in Japan. It is 9 o'clock p.m. in London. And it is 4 o'clock p.m. in our home time zone of New York. And again, your minutes stay the same. So it's technically 4:03 in New York, 9:03 in London, and 6:03 a.m. in Tokyo, Japan. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. But really, the more you use GMT style watch and the GMT bezel, the easier it gets. So hopefully that was a little helpful, and that's how you track all 3 time zones. So what are the negatives? Well, I really only have one, and that would be the loom. I really wish that they printed a few more layers on this dial. The loom is okay. I'll pop in a loom shot right now. As you can see, it's not terrible, but it's really not the brightest. Glycine has improved this, especially on the Glycine Airman bronze. That thing glows like a torch. So I would like to see them put a few more layers on the Airman in the future, but I really cannot find much to complain about this watch. especially considered the price I paid, which was $350. The movement is almost worth that. So I really struggle to find anything wrong with it. It's probably my bias because I love this watch, but yeah, that's really all I can say. So I hope my love for the Airman is apparent during this video, and I really hope that this video helps you appreciate the Airman, even if you don't own one. This watch really does deserve more appreciation amongst the watch community. So I appreciate any of you guys who watched all the way to the very end. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.